Welcome to CUNY Laureates, the show about CUNY graduates who went on to win major awards in their respective fields. In today's special episode, we look back at 3 CUNY graduates and Guggenheim Fellows who have all channeled the essence of New York City through the art of the pen. First, we learn how Paule Marshall's upbringing among brownstones in Brooklyn shaped her career as a writer. Then, Katchor recreates and reimagines the history of New York's Lower East Side through the art of the comic strip. Finally, from the Bronx to Coney Island and Persia to Greece, Saul Yurick took inspiration from the distant past to explore the problems of the present in his novel-turned-cult classic film, The Warriors.
Warriors, come on to play!
Glancing down the interminable Brooklyn street, you thought of those joined brownstones as one house reflected through a train of mirrors, with no walls between the houses, but only vast rooms, yawning endlessly, one into the other. Yet, looking close, you saw that under the thick ivy, each house had something distinctly its own. Some touch that was Gothic, Romanesque, Baroque, or Greek, triumphed amid the Victorian clutter. Here, Ionic columns framed the windows, while next door, gargoyles scowled up at the sun. There, the cornices were hung with carved foliage, while gorgon heads decorated the others. Many houses had bay windows of Gothic stonework. A few boasted turrets raised high above the other roofs. Yet, they all shared the same brown monotony. All seemed doomed by the confusion in their design. Behind those grim facades,
in those high rooms, life soared and ebbed. In her novel, Brown Girl, Brownstones, author Paule Marshall used a typical Brooklyn brownstone as a symbol of her family's struggle to adapt to a life in the new world. And in doing so, offered an intimate look at the hopes and dreams of millions of West Indian immigrants living in the United States. This is a story of a CUNY graduate who became a Guggenheim Fellow and her lifelong passion for writing. Born in 1929 as Valenza Pauline Burke to a family of Barbadian immigrants in Brooklyn, New York, Paule was expected to fit the mold and find practical means of sustaining her livelihood. After Paule's father decided to leave the family and join a religious cult in Harlem, her mother Ada was left with little understanding for her daughter's affinity for writing. Ironically, it was her mother's everyday conversations with other Bayesian housewives and mothers in the kitchen of their brownstone that initially inspired Paule to become a writer. I grew up around poets, she later recalled in her essay, From the Poets in the Kitchen. They taught me my first lessons in the narrative art. They trained my ear. They set a standard of excellence. This is why the best of my work must be attributed to them. It stands as testimony to the rich legacy of language and culture they so freely pass on to me in the workshop of the kitchen. After being introduced to poet and novelist Paul Laurence Dunbar and his exceptional ability to capture Southern Black dialect as poetry, her thirst for the written word became unquenchable. Out of respect for her fellow writer, but also believing that her explicitly female name may hurt her prospects when applying for jobs in journalism, Pauline Marshall decided to drop the end of her given name and change it to a more masculine form, Paul. Suggestively, and most likely out of spite, she decided to keep the E silent as a potent reminder of her sacrifice. At the tender age of 13, however, she still wouldn't dare to consider herself a writer. At least, not under her mother's watch. In 1949, Paule enrolled in Hunter College, with plans of becoming a social worker. Soon after, however, she contracted tuberculosis and spent a year recovering in a local sanatorium. As luck would have it, this unfortunate period of her life had a surprisingly positive outcome. The time spent at the sanatorium allowed her to immerse herself in books, and after recovering, she firmly decided to pursue a degree in English literature at Brooklyn College. It was here at Brooklyn College that she had her first taste of creative writing and started working on her first book, Brown Girl, Brownstones. In this semi-autobiographical novel, published in 1959, a girl named Selena lives with her Barbadian parents in a typical Brooklyn brownstone. This brownstone becomes the main point of contention between her belligerent parents, a father who longs to return to Barbados, and a mother who sees the ownership of the brownstone as the only true way of achieving the American dream. Using Selena's growing pains to capture the essence of the Afro-Caribbean immigrant experience, Paule Marshall became one of the first Black female writers to reach wider recognition by tackling problems of race, gender, class, and cultural identity. Yet for Paule, this was a very personal book. It served in many ways as a rite of passage, so I could move from my childhood, so I could take up my life and move forward, she later wrote. And move forward she did. After graduating from Brooklyn College in 1953, Paule started writing for a living. Her first job at Our World, a popular magazine for African American readers, taught her discipline in writing and informed her on contemporary trends in Black communities across the United States. In her capacity as staff travel journalist, she visited Brazil and the Caribbean islands, and there had some of her first experiences with Black communities outside the United States. Her career as a journalist, however, was short-lived. In 1961, after publishing a collection of novellas titled Sold, Clap Hand, and Sing, Paule was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship, and the following year received the Rosenthal Family Foundation Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Now officially recognized, Paule's work caught the eye of Langston Hughes, and in 1965, he invited her to join him on his state-sponsored European tour. This experience had a major impact on her career as a writer. Under the wing of this giant of African American literary canon, Paule developed a stronger sense of her Pan-African identity, and in the following years started looking for inspiration outside of the boundaries of her individual experience, from West Africa to South America, the West Indies to the southern United States. Her stories drew their power from the histories of people spread across 3 different continents, yet belonging to one cultural identity, one people divided by the ocean.
When you walk along the Atlantic, you can hear a kind, and as it comes in a powerful waves, it's as if it's tearing itself apart. And you know, the whole ritual in Shiva is the Jewish ritual of mourning, that the women, sort of tear their clothes and so on. As I walked, the first time I walked along the Atlantic in Barbados, I said, this sea is sitting Shiva for the tyranny that took place.
This reinforced sense of self led Paule to become active in the civil rights movement and Black nationalist movements of the 1960s. Yet equally important was her role in the Black feminist movement. As one of the first female writers to explore the role of a Black woman in contemporary American society, Paule had a major influence on the wave of Black female writers that emerged in the 1960s and 70s, including such names as Maya Angelou, Toni Morrison, and Alice Walker. Traditionally in most fiction, men are the wheelers and dealers. They are the ones in whom power is invested, she wrote in 1979. I wanted to turn that around. I wanted women to be the centers of power. Virtually every book that Paule wrote in her long career featured a strong female character, a Black woman deeply affected by both the limitations of her current condition as well as the long history of suffering of her people. Yet, a woman powerful enough to break through those limitations and find inner means for change and spiritual awakening. In 1992, at the age of 63, Paule received a MacArthur Fellowship. Paule Marshall is a writer of fiction who engages social issues without compromising the nuances of her powerfully realized characters, the foundation concluded. In her intricately crafted novels, Marshall explores the theme of healing, the healing of divided selves, divided cultures, and a divided world. In her memoir, Triangular Road, published in 2009, Paule Marshall identified herself as a tripartite person, a woman equally defined by her African roots, Barbadian ancestry, and her upbringing here in Brooklyn, New York. And while Paule's mother never achieved the American dream of owning a brownstone in Brooklyn, her daughter's powerful writing opened those same brownstones to millions of people and shared that unique kitchen poetry of her childhood with the world. New York is a city of 8 million ever-evolving stories. Cartoonist Katchor added one more New York story by creating a fictional Big Apple one step removed from a bygone-era New York. This is the story of a CUNY graduate who became a Guggenheim Fellow whose cartoons transport us to places of old New York, like B&H Dairy, which opened in 1938.
He's wandering around this city that's not New York. It's a city I invented. I wanted to be a tourist in this city. And I wanted the excitement of discovering a city as big as New York, maybe of the same age as New York. That's how he comes upon all of these adventures. You know, I don't know how many there are. I grew up just after underground comics, Robert Crumb, Bill Griffith, and some of those concentrated on sex and, drug taking. So that was done already. I thought that was not something I wanted to make comics about. I would make comics about these forgotten aspects of urban life. Yeah, I wanted to talk about small business, the impulses behind small business people. It's because it hadn't been done. I thought it was an ignored area to write about. I came across this idea that there was such a field as real estate photography. It was in a listing in the Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature. There's a fortune to be made in real estate photography, and I'd never heard of this field, but people went around for real estate agents taking pictures of buildings. That's what it was, a very utilitarian kind of work. The weekly strip is very short. They're almost like a haiku. They're like 10 lines. I would say there's a real condensed feeling to them, like a short pop song, or a short poem. This strip is based on lots of things I saw or imagined or dreamt about, but Knipl is not aware of the narration. The narration is always in another voice, the voice of the author. He's not me, I'm the narrator. He's just the man who brings us around the city. And you see him suffering and going through all the anguish of a small business person. Brooklyn College was sort of the neighborhood college where I grew up in the Kensington section of Brooklyn. I majored in studio art. At that time, there was the English department and the art department, but in the antique forms of drawing and writing, they never came together. Whenever I talked about stories with my art teachers, they said, well, if you have to make up a story, do it, but it doesn't, I have nothing to say about stories. I was able to do figure drawing, which came in handy for making comics. A lot of people outgrow the comics they grew up with, which whether they were superheroes or, adventure comics. I sort of outgrew them from a literary point of view. And I started reading at Brooklyn College, and I took a lot of literature courses. A lot, it seems like a lot. I read a lot, a novel a night. My interest in storytelling moved outside of those genres. So I knew I had to make comics that dealt with all sorts of aspects of the world. Over the years, I was always attracted to dairy restaurants. There were quite a few of them in New York, and I went to them since my childhood and as a young adult. And I would say in the 70s and 80s, they were all closing as I went to them. The ones I knew in New York were all run by Eastern European Jews. They were below the notice of restaurant historians, and they were not like touristic places that would even have postcards. A lot of them I drew from memory because I didn't take pictures of them. I talk about this thing that I call the Milch Dicke personality, the dairy personality. The atmosphere in these places was a very low-key, ruminative more than appetitive. People sat and thought about things, hatched schemes. They didn't do anything. They just, a lot of thinking and sitting around and over a cup of coffee and a noodle kugel. Everything, you see around us, like the shapes of these very standard, the salt shakers, these napkin holders, are just imbued with a lot of significance just because they follow you through life. They're the background material to everyone's life. And you don't think about them, but they're there. Just like dairy restaurants. I went to these places and I just took them for granted. I said, these are here. They were here before I was born, and they'll probably be here forever. But that wasn't the case. The pedagogical point of the strip is to make people aware of a certain kind of urban life that's somewhat endangered in certain cities by, globalization, chain stores, gentrification, all these things that make it really hard for a small business like the one we're in right now to exist. I think if you read these strips, you'll realize what the value of that kind of, the invention of small business. Small business people have to be inventive. They don't have a lot of money to pay a designer to do their signage. So there's that kind of invention going on. And I think that's what I like people to come away with.
The year is 401 BC. After a failed campaign to install Cyrus as king of Persia, the Greek mercenaries he hired are now alone. The truce with the Persians has been broken, and their allies have abandoned them. They're stranded deep in enemy territory. Full of these reflections and despondent as they were, but few of them tasted food at evening. Few kindled a fire. Unable to sleep for grief and longing for their native states and parents, their wives and children, whom they thought they should never see again. But a young soldier named Xenophon convinces the others to continue their march home. Better to try and fight, he says, than to surrender to those who have already made false promises of peace. The soldiers set out, followed by enemy forces, in the hot Babylonian sun. But what do an ancient Greek army, Coney Island, and Brooklyn College all have in common? Well, they all played a key role in the writing of a provocative novel turned cinema cult classic. This is a story of a CUNY graduate who became a Guggenheim Fellow, and the story he wrote about a group of urban warriors. It's 1954, and Solomon Yurick has yet to sell a novel. To make ends meet, he takes a job as a social investigator at the New York Department of Welfare, where he works with the poorest and most marginalized in the city, including those who were known at the time as juvenile delinquents. But Saul becomes disillusioned with the job, witnessing the failures of bureaucracy firsthand. Furthermore, he struggles to understand why his clients feel so hopeless, since his own experience with poverty was very different. Growing up in the Great Depression, Saul's family also survived on welfare checks. But far from feeling hopeless, Saul's parents, Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, were committed communists who believed strongly in resisting systems of oppression. His own politics, however, could only go so far. After the Hitler-Stalin Pact of 1939 saw the Soviet Union cut a deal with Nazi Germany, Saul broke with his father and enlisted in the U.S. Army. "My feelings as a Jew," he said, "were more important than my feelings as a communist." After the war, Saul attended college at NYU, where he dabbled in science and psychology before settling on literature. Here, he first read Anabasis, the ancient book by Xenophon about the Greeks' escape from Persia in 401 BC. He decided to become a writer, but after working at the Department of Welfare for nearly a decade and having no success in getting any writing published, Saul decided to quit and pursue a master's degree at Brooklyn College. Saul was given permission to write a novel as his thesis project. Informed by his experiences with the absurdity of bureaucracy, Saul's novel, Fertig, tells the story of a man who commits murder to protest a corrupt medical system that caused his child's death. But to no avail. His act of protest is hopelessly distorted by the self-interested lawyers, journalists, and psychoanalysts involved in his case. Rebellion, in the end, is just more food for a chattering establishment. Although he received encouraging notes from publishers, no one was willing to bite. So he moved on to his next novel, a book named The Warriors. The Warriors was to be a retelling of Xenophon's Anabasis, but with teenage gangs in New York City instead of Greek mercenaries in Persia. After an attempt to unify New York street gangs and take over the city goes awry, the protagonists, a small gang called the Dominators, are forced to make their way across hostile territory back to their home turf in Coney Island. In the 1960s, as in most eras, America had an obsession with teenage violence. The seemingly irrational violence of teenage gangs became a source of fear for the public, fueling panicked literature and movies on the subject. But Saul sought to understand the phenomenon better and conducted intensive research for the book. He walked the lengths of the city where his story took place, including a stretch of subway tunnel from 96th Street to 110th Street in Manhattan, and even went so far as to rent a truck from which he could spy on teenage gang members on their own turf. What he found was a culture that mimicked the power structures of society at large. They had their hierarchies, strict codes, infighting. They engaged in rituals, oaths, and intergang diplomacy. In short, they provided the most impoverished and hopeless children of New York with a version of the society and values they were excluded from. In that context, gang violence was, to the participants, entirely rational. Bimbo genuflected in front of Hector, took the cigarette from him, said, "This brother will serve his family till he dies," pinched out the coal, and stuck the sign in the side of his hatband, and also took a drink. As each man said that this brother would serve his family till he died, they felt more and more the fighting spirit uniting them into one, till they could take on anyone. It was this parallel between teenage gangs and their larger society that also reinforced Saul's decision to connect them to the distant past. After all, he wrote in his afterword to the Warriors, were the Greeks really so noble? In 1965, The Warriors was picked up for publication and became Saul Yurick's first novel. Following its success, Saul was finally able to publish Fertig, which was released in 1966, followed quickly by a third novel in 1968, The Bag. With the novels came a resurgent interest in politics. Never having fully abandoned the leftist politics of his parents, Saul began supporting Students for a Democratic Society in their protests against the Vietnam War, and even worked on a socialist version of Monopoly named Class Struggle. Over time, his political advocacy could sometimes supersede his reputation as an author. Saul Yurick, an editor once asked sardonically, does he really write books? I thought he only signed petitions. But to Saul, writing and advocacy were very much one and the same. My model for fiction is a paraphrase of Marx, that it isn't enough to describe the eternal verities and their variations, but to change what we think about them and to move people to action. In 1972, Saul Yurick received the Guggenheim Fellowship for his work in fiction. 2 more novels followed, as well as a collection of short stories. But it was another medium entirely that would ultimately cement his legacy.
Warrior, come up to play.
After being approached by multiple producers about adapting The Warriors, Saul agreed to sell the rights to a Hollywood studio in the hopes that it might get the now out-of-print book republished. The movie, directed by Walter Hill and released in 1979, took the intensely researched, troubled characters Saul had based on his own experiences and replaced them with comic book-inspired caricatures and over-the-top costumes. The film has since become a cult classic, seeing multiple re-releases, action figures, a video game adaptation, and a concept album by Lin-Manuel Miranda, with a stage version set to premiere on Broadway in 2027. But left behind amidst the Hollywood glitz and cult popularity were the real-life teenagers that Saul wrote about. There was no revolution, and certainly no royalties, for the down and out of New York. I looked for my novel on the screen. I found the skeleton of it intact. Its revolutionary content was missing. With the decline of mass movements in the 1980s onwards, Saul became something of a political orphan. He pivoted towards nonfiction and free-form social analysis, much of it going unpublished. And while he never ceased to invigorate and provoke the intellectual circles in which he was a part, the revolution would have to wait. Like the expedition of Cyrus in 401 BC, the 1960s and 70s failed to bring a lasting revolution, ending instead with political defeats, divided leadership, and even some bloodshed. But while the people that Saul wrote about weren't able to conquer the system ruling over them, time will tell if they can at least find a way home.